What's God up to? Ultimately, our salvation. That's true. It's a divine comedy. The Bible's not like, hey, who knows? Either it could be this. No. Its trajectory is toward salvation. But what a rocky road the Lord has for us.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the Senior Publishing Director. Today we wrap up our series on understanding Genesis by looking at one of the final episodes in this great book, namely the story of Joseph, the great figure who went from slave to ruler of Egypt. And of course, we're here to talk about that with Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon. Always good to see you.
We always like to update people on your latest comings and goings, and you recently gave a really good talk at the Thomistic Institute on Thomas and the New Atheist, Thomas Aquinas, of course. Tell us about that talk and how it was received.
Yeah, it was for the feast day of St. Thomas on January 28th, and they asked me at St. Mark's Parish, which is a parish of the Archdiocese, but right on the campus of UCSB, University of California at Santa Barbara out here. And so it's a bit like a Newman Center, type feel. I've gone there many, many times to say Mass and visit with the young people. It's a great place. A lot of vocations have come out of that parish. So the new pastor is a wonderful guy. He's a young Franciscan and invited me to come. And so I gave a talk. It's a version of talks I've given before on Aquinas and the New Atheists. And my point being, in a way, Thomas would agree with all the New Atheists, that the God that they reject is a God he'd reject too, because they don't really understand what serious religious people mean by the word God. So I gave a pretty serious paper to that effect, maybe 45 minutes, then followed by Q&A for a while. So I like the Thomistic Institute, of course, and happy with the work they're doing. And I on purpose wanted to give a serious, substantive paper on that university campus because, for too long, as I've been saying for years, we've been dumbing down the faith. And after the council, we got very, very bad at conveying to people our own very serious understanding of God. And we've suffered from that. We became victims of the New Atheists because we weren't able to defend ourselves well when they came after us. So even though maybe some of the audience didn't know what I was talking about, I wanted to give a fairly high-level talk there. So you can check it out. It's on YouTube.
We'll be sure to include a link to that in the show notes for this episode.
Good.
Okay, let's get back into our series on understanding Genesis. I think this is the fifth and final one we've done. We've talked about creation, Adam and Eve, the fall. We did Abraham, we did Isaac, we did Jacob. And so now we're wrapping it up with the great story of Joseph. Let's just begin at the literary level. I know you've said before, this is among the great literary masterpieces of the Western tradition, isn't it?
Absolutely. Look at Thomas Mann, the great German 20th century novelist, writes this, 5-volume Joseph and His Brothers based on this story. William Faulkner, I might have quoted this before when the greatest American novelist of the 20th century was asked, what do you read? And he said, the Bible, mostly the Old Testament. And Jordan Peterson recently has said, I think completely correctly, that the Bible is the foundation for all the Western culture. Whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not, it's simply the case that the Bible is the foundation for everything in the West. And these stories, we say, correctly, they're inspired by God. But as you say, just from a purely literary standpoint, the longevity of these stories, how they continue, even though across thousands of years, they continue to speak very deeply to the human heart, is testament to their literary and psychological power. To mention Peterson again, that's really what he's doing in a lot of his talks on the Bible, is showing this psychological dimension, which is indeed powerful. But then when you add the layer, as we do, of what God is saying to us in these stories, then they take on a depth unlike any other literature in the world.
Well, as we begin this story, we're introduced to a 17-year-old boy, Joseph.
Yeah.
He's clearly favored by his father. He's got a bunch of other brothers, but his father likes him the most, it seems. He gives Joseph this multicolored robe. And then Joseph begins to have these dreams, which underscore even more his privileged status. He's standing over and above his brothers and eventually even above the sun and the moon and the stars. What's the author trying to convey here with these images?
It's wonderful, isn't it? And you're a father of many kids, and people have talked about this dynamic, over the centuries of parents who favoring a given child, et cetera. And the Bible's pretty blunt and upfront that, yeah, this is the favorite child of Jacob, and he gives him this code. And so you're a young kid, you're your father's clear favorite. You're undoubtedly gifted, as Joseph, clearly is. Well, when you're that age, you're not very mature. You haven't had a lot of life experience. You haven't been knocked around too much by life. You can get a very inflated sense of self. And I think that Joseph we meet at the beginning of the story is probably to his brothers, understandably obnoxious figure, and in himself, a very immature figure, suffering from what Jung might have called ego inflation. And so the dreams are representative of that to a degree, that here I am and you're all bowing down to me. And, the wonderful irony, of course, is that those dreams are also prophetic. They're predictive that one day, in fact, the brothers would bow down to Joseph, but only after he had been through an awful discipline. See, if he at that moment in his life, 17 years old, multicolored coat, look at me, bow down to me, well, he would have been God awful. He would have been the worst leader, the worst chieftain you could imagine, because when you combine high egotism and power, that's really dangerous. I mean, we've seen that all across the centuries. So the biblical story is, so wise, even psychologically, that yes, indeed, Joseph, you are special. You are. Yes, indeed, your father is seeing something in you. That's why he's favoring you. And yes, indeed, your brothers will bow down to you. But it's going to happen only when you've been through an extraordinary discipline, which will enable you as a chieftain, as a leader, to be a person of love and justice. See? But boy, he wasn't ready at the beginning. And so like many of these biblical figures, think of Moses, for example, they have to go through the long discipline of the desert before they're ready for leadership.
Let's talk about that long road of discipline. Maybe not unexpectedly, his brothers become jealous of him. They say in the book of Genesis, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him." Joseph is cast down into the pit, and eventually he's rescued by these passing traders on their way to Egypt. How do we read this episode spiritually? What's going on as Joseph is thrown down into the pit?
Look, his brothers are awful at this point. His brothers are cruel and they're murderous even. So I'm not saying one little positive thing about them. However, curiously, they're instruments of God's providence, because Joseph has to go through the discipline. And you find this in a lot of archetypal stories. And we talk a lot today about the hero's journey and all that. But you'll find this motif of having to go all the way down before you can rise again. Look at Dante under this rubric. So Dante, who begins in the Divine Comedy, kind of full of himself, and I'm going to just climb that mountain, and I'm going to get out of this problem I have. No, you have to go through a long discipline, and Dante has to go all the way down to the pits of hell, and then all the way up through Mount Purgatory before he's ready. So something similar here, I think. Joseph being thrown into the well, going down, he'll continue his downward journey as well once he gets to Egypt. But that's the discipline needed before he can rise to be, in a salutary way, in a position of leadership and prominence. So the brothers are no good at this point, but they are weirdly instruments of God's providence that's providing for the disciplining of Joseph.
So Joseph makes his way to Egypt. He's eventually sold as a slave to Potiphar, who's this high-ranking official in Egypt. Potiphar likes him, trusts him, until Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph. Joseph resists repeatedly, tries to run away, but the wife catches hold of Joseph's garment, and she uses the thread as evidence to frame him for assaulting her. As a result, Joseph is then thrown into prison, where he spends several years. So he goes from this deep pit, now he's in prison. What do we glean from these turns of events?
What a great story just at the narrative level. that Joseph is a gifted person, so his father saw it for sure. The brothers undoubtedly intuited it, which is one reason they were jealous of him. And now, he's sold as a slave. Now, that's a foreshadowing as well, isn't it? So a Jew being a slave in Egypt, well, that's anticipating the 400 years of enslavement of his descendants in Egypt. But even in that condition, well, he's noticed by Potiphar, this high-ranking official, and he puts him in charge of his house. He's like the major domo of the house. Well, he must have seen his intelligence, his responsibility, his creativity, all these good qualities. So he rises for a time. But then as you describe that, especially now, Brandon, when we've all in our culture, whether it's in the church, the sex abuse scandals, it's the Me Too movement in the wider culture, we are exquisitely sensitive to these plays of power, how sex and power come together. If you're in a powerful position vis-a-vis somebody else, you can exploit them sexually. And so that's where, Joseph is caught because he's portrayed as a decent person. As the wife of Potiphar is seducing him, he says, no, I'm not going to violate my master's trust, nor will I violate the law of God. So he's being very upright. And then she manipulates him. Again, look, right out of the Me Too, or to be fair, right out of, the clergy sex abuse scandals, when some nefarious priests use their power over young people to get what they wanted sexually. So, boy, that story is right out of the newspapers today, it seems to me. And, when I revisit it, I sort of feel those same, I totally get how this kid was manipulated by these powerful people. So it's awful. It's awful. Just as his brothers were awful, so the wife of Potiphar, awful person, awful, manipulative person. But both, again, weirdly, under the providence of God, because this whole story is proceeding according to God's purpose and under the aegis of God's grace. And so that's a hard truth, but an important one in the Bible, that even terrible things and terrible people, God can permit for his own ultimate purposes. And look, how much time has gone by from the time he's thrown in the well by his brothers, sold into slavery. Now years with Potiphar, Now it's going to be years in prison. How long will this discipline take? Well, as long as it takes. What did Joseph need before he was ready for leadership? Well, maybe all of these years of terrible suffering.
While Joseph is languishing in prison, it becomes clear that he has a gift for interpreting dreams. And so the Pharaoh himself hears of this and asks Joseph to unpack his own dream. And it's really interesting, this dream Pharaoh's having. There's 7 healthy cattle that are being devoured by 7 weak cattle, right, and then 7 plump ears of grain that are devoured by 7 withered ears of grain.
Yeah.
Joseph impressively interprets the dream to the Pharaoh's surprise and satisfaction. And then a Pharaoh appoints him second in command. So he goes from prison all the way up almost to the top. How should we understand this turn of events from slavery and prison to basically the prime minister of Egypt? What lessons does it reveal?
Well, first of all, the gift of this again of Joseph. Father saw it, Potiphar saw it, now Pharaoh sees it. And so this young man is gifted. He's graced. The Lord is with him. And the Bible is very interested in dreams, which, that's after Freud and then in Jung and company in the 20th century, we got interested again in dreams. So people, going through psychotherapy sometimes, or there's just a cultural interest in dreams. Well, the Bible was all over that a long time ago. They knew that sometimes God speaks to us through dreams. Think of Daniel here, right, who famously interprets a dream of the king. But another connection, Brandon, is to this Joseph's namesake in the New Testament, because the New Testament Joseph receives in a dream a message from an angel. He twice is instructed in a dream. And also that Joseph takes his wife and child into Egypt, where they spend some time before coming back to the Promised Land, in a way recapitulating Joseph's journey into Egypt and then eventually his descendants' journey back out again. So the New Testament authors see these wonderful parallels between them. But what we're seeing here is the culmination of a long process. young kid full of gifts, got the Technicolor dream coat on. He's the favorite of his father, all that. But boy, he wasn't ready. And he needed lots and lots and lots of the disciplining of the ego. That's always what it is, to enable you to become a vehicle of grace. See, if the ego is dominant, then whatever you receive is going to be for your benefit. That's the way it works with us sinners, is I receive gifts of whatever they are, intelligence, creativity, popularity, good looks, or whatever it is. Well, okay, great. I'll use them for my aggrandizement. I'll use them to become famous and rich and powerful. That's always dangerous because that blocks the flow of grace. See, because grace is only in gift form, right? If I take what's given to me and I make it a possession, it stops being grace. And then it becomes destructive to people around me. So there's that danger again of especially gifted people getting into positions of power and authority. If they're not disciplined at the level of their ego, they will do enormous damage. What's happened, we presume now, during these long years of discipline is the ego of Joseph has been broken so that he can now become a vehicle of grace to others when he gets into a position of authority. So now through God's providence, and it's a wonderful, like, Count of Monte Cristo type story. Here's this guy in prison, can you imagine an Egyptian prison in the ancient world, what that was like? And to be lifted up to be the vizier of Egypt, to be the second in command, and given the collar and given the outfit and everything. But he's ready. He's ready. And the dreams, of course, were God's way of communicating what he'll be ready for. So he understands there'll be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. We better get ourselves organized so that we can, store up the grain so we can then, feed not just Egypt, but indeed the whole world. And it's Joseph who saw it in the dream of Pharaoh. And then Joseph now in a position to be a graceful leader so that he can now be the instrument by which God feeds the world. That's the beauty of the story. Let's say that little obnoxious kid at the beginning, right, the 17-year-old Joseph, at that moment had become vizier of Egypt. He'd be a disaster. He would have visited pain and suffering on his own people and people around him. Now he's ready. And he becomes, in fact, this great spiritual figure.
I want to continue a theme you mentioned just a second ago, this motif you see throughout the Old Testament, even up into the New Testament, of a child of Israel who infiltrates a foreign nation. Yeah, you see that with Joseph, you see it with Moses, you see it with Christ. Say more about that motif. What are the scriptures trying to get at here?
I think it's a wonderful motif. Moses, as you say, also Esther, also Daniel, also here Joseph. I call it the Jew behind enemy lines motif. And I'm taking that from our friend C.S. Lewis. That how come Jesus came so clandestinely and so quietly in this distant outpost of the Roman Empire? Well, because he had to slip clandestinely behind enemy lines. You're not going to announce the army marching its way. You send a little expeditionary force quietly at night, slip behind enemy lines. So here now is an Israelite, someone formed by the God of Israel, who's now going to operate within the power structure of a non-Israelite nation. It's anticipating something, and we Christians totally get this, because the God of Israel is meant to be worshiped by the whole world. He's not just the God of this particular nation. He chose that particular nation so that they might become the vehicle through which he become the Lord of the world. And we see in Christ and in Christian preaching how that happened. But it's anticipated, I think, in all these stories, Joseph and Moses and Esther and Daniel and many others. It's anticipation of this great act by which the God of Israel infiltrates all the cultures of the world. How weird and wonderful, Brandon, that here I am, descendant of Irish people, from the farthest end of Europe, who then made their way all the way across an ocean to this continent that these biblical people never even dreamed existed. And yet here I am as a bishop of a church that is focused upon the worship of the God of Israel. How weird that is. What a weird story that is. But it's anticipated in this sort of story of Joseph now operating with his Israelite consciousness and moral sensibility, but within the structures of a foreign nation. Good. That's the missionary outreach of the church.
There's a whole lot more drama that takes place in this story. Joseph meets all of his brothers who come and meet him not knowing who he is, and there's
Marvelous.
back and forth events there. I want to fast forward though to the end of the account. At the end of the story, all of Joseph's brothers and his father make their way to Egypt, and they take up residence on prime real estate in Egypt.
Yeah.
Joseph rides out on a chariot to meet his father. And there's this beautiful scene when the two of them meet. They embrace, and Joseph, we are told, wept on his father's neck for a good while. It seems like such a beautiful ending, but as you've pointed out, this transplantation of Jacob's family all the way to Egyptian soil sets in motion a much longer enslavement of Israel. Say something about that ending.
Yeah, there's so much there. You're right. And I don't honestly, Brandon, know any story that's more emotionally powerful. And those scenes when the brothers come, and when I first read the story as a kid, I thought, well, how would they not have recognized them? And but years have passed. How people can change. And then imagine Joseph at this point, all in the regalia of a vizier of Egypt. The Egyptians too wore makeup. The men wore like a dark makeup around the eyes and all this, and maybe a big headgear. And so I get that now. I'm sure they wouldn't have recognized him physically. And then more to it, he's been years in Egypt. He would have learned the language. And they play with that in the narrative, don't they? Is that as the brothers are talking, they presume, this Egyptian guy won't know what we're talking about. But of course he understands them. And then he pretends he only speaks, Egyptian. That scene is so powerful. So someone like Thomas Mann writes the 5 volumes. But also think of John the 23rd, when he received a delegation of Jewish representatives at the Vatican at a time when the church, was not real forthcoming in dialogue with Jews. And he opened his arms and said, "I am Joseph, your brother." And he was calling on this beautiful scene, that, yeah, we are. I mean, all Christians are brothers to the Jews. And I think what he was saying was, look, I got all this regalia on, I'm regalia of the Pope, but look, I'm Joseph, your brother. I don't know any scenes that are more moving and more powerful. And then as you say, Jacob, poor old Jacob, who for years was convinced that his favorite son had been killed. And, this is only barely hinted at in the Bible. But so they come back with the story. Oh, yeah, he's killed by a wild animal. Look, there's blood on the coat. He's no dummy, Jacob. He must, and he knew the brothers were jealous of Joseph. He must have thought they were involved, which indeed they were. Can you imagine the heartache of that father? Not only his favorite son, presumed dead, but his other sons implicated in it? I mean, awful. The suffering of Jacob at that point. So then the fact that he's able to reunite with all his sons, including Joseph, I don't know. What's more emotional? What's a more beautiful, heartfelt story in all the literature of the world? If you got one, show me, because I don't know one. Wonderful. But as you say, typical of the Bible, especially the Old Testament. Okay, happy ending, and they lived happily ever after. Well, no, because this is the end of Genesis, right? So Genesis ends with this wonderful thing, but then Exodus begins. And what do we hear about almost immediately? There came upon the throne of Egypt a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. So for a while, the Pharaoh was a great friend of Joseph. And you imagine that maybe for a few generations, they still remembered this connection. But then eventually a Pharaoh that, what? Who are these people? How'd they get here? And then the 400 years of slavery ensue. What's God up to? Ultimately, our salvation. That's true. It's a divine comedy. The Bible's not like, hey, who knows? Either it could be this. No. Its trajectory is toward salvation. But what a rocky road the Lord has for us. And so Egypt, which looks like the place of salvation, and indeed it was, because that's where the food was. And they come to Egypt where we have plenty of food and we'll be fine. in short order becomes the place of slavery. Okay, what's God up to? I'm not always sure, but I got to have trust. Look, in weal and woe, in plenty and in famine, that God is about his business of leading me to salvation. I think that's what's going on there, Brandon.
Let's close with this question. We can read this great story in Genesis at several levels. We can read it from the Jewish perspective, the psychological, the moral perspective. How should a Christian read this? As a Christian, what's the big takeaway for you?
Well, I'd say that these great figures in the Old Testament are all types of Christ. So I read things in the patristic manner. There's one great author of the Bible, God, and that God is using, as Aquinas says, both words and things to communicate his meaning. And he can use a thing, meaning like a historical person or event, to anticipate typologically what takes place in the New Testament. So is Joseph, he's a type of Joseph the dreamer in the New Testament, that's true. But he's also a Christ figure in many ways, isn't he? A kind of dying and rising experience, the going down and coming up. The one who becomes the ruler who ends up feeding the world. First Israel, you might say, but then the rest of the world. And so Joseph, the vizier of Egypt, having gone through this sort of dying and rising, and now the one who feeds the world, well, we recognize that. That's Christ, the risen Christ, who feeds the world with his body and blood. I would do that. And then, Jesus, the child Jesus, born in Bethlehem, but then taken into Egypt and then brought back again. That recapitulates the journey of his own people. So I would tend to not impose, that's not the right word. I would tend to see a typological reading here of this great story.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Every episode, we take one from listeners like you. If you have a question from Bishop Barron, send it in to us at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today, we have a question from Kristen. She's asking for your advice on studying philosophy. Here's her question.
Hi, my name is Kristen. I'm from New York. And my question is, how do you begin learning philosophy casually without getting bogged down in all the terminology? And how can one avoid arrogance while in the pursuit of this new philosophical understanding?
Yeah, thank you for that. Philosophy is how I got into it. When I say it, I mean here the whole religious thing. It was Thomas's philosophy really that got me intrigued. So God uses whatever means he can. I probably got into it the wrong way by just going and getting a book of Thomas Aquinas, and I'm trying to read it when I was 14. Probably not the best. I'd recommend, if you're interested in religious philosophy especially, get someone like Peter Kraft. I know Brandon's a great fan of his, as I am too. He has a lot of books, I think, that are very good. They're substantive about philosophy, and especially philosophy in relation to religious issues. What would you recommend, Brandon? Which book in philosophy especially?
He's got a great one called Philosophy 101, where it focuses on Socrates. He's got these great Socratic dialogues, which I like, where he'll take Socrates and put him in conversation with several modern philosophers, even Jesus. So it's a good way and a fun way to learn philosophy.
Yeah, I think I'd recommend that. And then if you want to get to the texts themselves, I, like most philosophy students, began with Plato's dialogues, the Apology, the Phaedo, the Republic, but the Euthyphro, some of those shorter, earlier ones, is a way to get into the way a philosopher thinks and works. But I might recommend Kraft. For Aquinas, I read F.C. Copleston, has a book called Aquinas, and that would just open the door to a lot of the basic philosophical moves. If you want to get really serious with Aquinas, you'd read the De Ente et Essentia, on being and essence, where Thomas, as a young man, he's about 25 when he writes that, he kind of lays out the terminology, the principles, the basic ideas of how to look at the world philosophically. There he reminds me of someone like our friend Ed Fazer. In his books on scholasticism, he's very good at that move, I think, of here's how a philosophical mind looks at the world. So there's a couple suggestions.
How How about the second part of that question? I'm curious how you would answer.
Oh, yeah.
How do you maintain humility when you're starting to learn these high things?
I mean, I think the texts in a way humiliate you because they're so rich and they're so complex. And I always found myself kind of humbled by philosophy. I never felt that I was becoming more arrogant. I felt I was becoming disciplined and like, why, I don't really understand that. And I need to really think about this. So I don't know. I think the texts themselves kind of humble you.
Well, thanks to all of you for joining us on this 5-part Understanding Genesis series. It's been great. We've covered a lot of territory. If you didn't hear the previous episodes, you can always go back and watch them at wordonfireshow.com. Before we go, I wanted to share with you the latest book from Word on Fire. It is titled With All the Saints, My Journey to the Roman Catholic Church, and it's by a fascinating guy named Mark Galli. Mark was, until recently, the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, which is the flagship evangelical publication started by Billy Graham. So he was a big name in the evangelical world as a theologian, author, pastor, but he has recently become Catholic. He entered the Catholic Church less than a year ago, and this book traces his whole journey. There's several pit stops along the way, including Anglicanism and Eastern Orthodoxy, until finally he landed in Catholicism. So it's a beautiful conversion memoir. I know, Bishop, you said you just got your copy, I think, yesterday and had spent a little time with it. What were your initial impressions?
Yeah, I loved it. I told you I went up to my room last night just to kind of look through it because it came to my house yesterday. And I ended up reading about 2/3 of it. It's very readable, and it's a very moving story. And, you know, it's a man that made a courageous decision because it meant leaving behind. It reminds you there of someone like Newman. I mean, leaving behind the life he knew and the profession he knew. But it's written in a pretty breezy, readable way. I think you'll enjoy it. It's short, too. It's only about 100 and some pages, maybe. So I would highly recommend it.
So pick up your copy at the website wordonfire.org/saints. Again, the book is titled With All the Saints. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel.